move forward. Okay, so can you see my slides now, Emma Jane?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So why did we start this Profs in Prep network? Well, McCanwell and Robson, this is an advanced HE guide called Promoting Teaching. It's all about recognising how excellent teaching can be rewarded and recognised within universities. And this is a lovely quote from them, that there are relatively few teaching focused staff in more senior positions who can review, mentor and support teaching staff, act as role models for junior staff who are seeking to develop a teaching or education career, help individuals to collate a mix of quantitative and qualitative evidence that provides a clear sense of their teaching achievements. So this was certainly something that Debbie and I, when we started out, really experienced, was this idea that there was nobody that we could see that could help us. There were a few people who were in these senior teaching focused roles, but they were incredibly busy people like Sally Brown, who was lovely and kind and helped lots of us, but we couldn't really sort of spend a lot of time with somebody to be mentored intensively, to watch what they did and try and do the same thing. They were often in different disciplines than us and doing different things. And also to know how to collate that evidence, how to capture that evidence and form it into a promotions application. And so we decided that the best thing to do was, rather than waiting for the sector to sort itself out, we would form this group ourselves and we would offer peer mentoring. So we decided you didn't have to be a professor to mentor somebody to be a professor. And we set up peer mentoring relationships. We had senior lecturers mentoring senior lecturers and readers and associate professors mentoring each other. And that was how it worked. And we did have a few profs who joined us, who helped along the way as well. And so Debbie designed this logo, the Profs in Prep logo. And the idea of it is that we're climbing the ladder together. We're not climbing up the ladder and then pulling it up behind us. Not that obviously we'd know anybody who'd do that. We're not climbing up the ladder and then waiting till we get to the top before we pull somebody else up with us. But as we climb, we're supporting our friends and colleagues to climb with us. And that's the idea. So in the absence of lots and lots of teaching focused profs, we would provide this network to help each other. And so the idea was that we would provide a supportive network, peers and professors working together to increase the numbers of teaching focused promotions and also success within teaching focused promotions. Sorry, I'm not sure if that link will work for the Profs in Prep joining link, but I'll share one in a little while. So we also wanted to facilitate reflection on our own development, to think about how we can support each other to reach our goals, and to create a pipeline community. So basically, the more of us that get through to those more senior roles, the more likely we are able to influence promotions panels, promotions criteria, and to mentor and support junior colleagues. And we're beginning to see that happen. So there have been quite a few successful professorial applications coming through the Profs in Prep network, one of whom was Debbie first, and later me. So it does work. So that's what Profs in Prep's all about. And I'm also a part of this teaching focused network that Emma Jane and others have set up along the way. And I think we have very similar values and very similar ethos. So I was really keen to come and do a session here about how we could support people on teaching focused careers towards promotion. And so it's good to see so many of you here. Okay, so that's the waffle bit over. I'm joining Hannah in the waffle Olympics. She doesn't waffle. And what I wanted to do was to start out by really thinking about a concept of scholarship identity or teaching excellence identity, and to start thinking about who we are and what we stand for, to start really reflecting on how we contribute to our institutions, how we contribute to higher education more generally, and to think about what it is that we bring to our working contexts. And our working contexts are all very different, but there are some things that we share. So really thinking about what is our expertise and how do we kind of identify with that expertise. So what I'm going to do is hand over to a series of colleagues, wonderful, wonderful colleagues, who are at different stages of their own career journeys, to talk about who they are and what they stand for, to talk about their scholarship identity or their narrative. And as you're listening, there's four of us talking, I want you to reflect, to think about who we are and what we stand for, to listen and think about our different identities. So really pulling out, what's the core element of each story that you hear. We'll only speak for a few minutes each. And then as you're thinking about that, start to try and piece together. Do you find that some stories are resonating with you? Are some stories quite alien to you? That's absolutely fine. And have a think about how you might construct your own story, your own narrative about your scholarship identity. So I'm going to hand over first to Colin, and you can see who everybody is here. Colin will hand over to Rose. Rose will hand over to Emma Jane, and Emma Jane will hand back to me. Okay, so over to you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Julie. That's great. I was thinking actually, because I've got quite a few animations on my slides, is it easier just for you to maybe show all of the animations at this stage, and then we can talk rather than me saying next slide? I think, is that okay? Yeah, no, I think that just might be easier. But thank you very much. That's great. Thanks. Great. Well, thank you so much all for coming. It's great to have so many of you here. I wanted to share a little bit about my journey as a very early career researcher in this area. So I want to talk through a little bit about my journey of trying to identify what Julie nicely refers to as a golden thread in thinking about where we can identify our contribution to scholarship and to promoting higher education innovation. So to see where I've kind of come from and what I can contribute to, just to give you a bit of flavour about where I've developed, where I think I'm kind of identifying a golden thread, and hopefully continue that through my career. So I come from a very academic background, so and in the sciences. So I started my PhD in 2010 at the University of Bath, where I focused on evolutionary genetics. So I'm a biologist and geneticist in my background, and I was very lucky in my PhD to have quite a few opportunities for public engagement. So I was involved in a few different local organizations like the University of the Third Age and different festivals that I was kind of contributing to. And that was my first kind of foray into education in a way, but educating the public. And I got a lot of excitement around that. And I organized a few skills sessions for my colleagues thinking about science communication. But it wasn't really until my postdoc then that I started working, I would say, really kind of engrossing myself into education initiatives. So I was really getting some experience outside of research and into the education field. And that was mostly through charities promoting social mobility and using public engagement with schools as a way to try to get young children to think about a scientific career. So that was mostly through the Sutton Trust, as I've identified there, and the Brilliant Club there as well. So I was able to go out and actually forge some educational structures, either through summer schools, so I ran some residential summer schools there, and also engagement with schools with underprivileged children around London. And I really, really enjoyed that. I really got my teeth into education and in there, and that was great. And to have that flexibility with my postdoc was really fortunate, I think, at that stage. And that led me to then to complete a postgraduate certificate in higher education, which was funded by the University of Imperial. And that really give me my first introduction to pedagogy and scholarship and understanding of education, really, because I'd come from quite a strong science background. So that was really, really lovely introduction into education and pedagogy. And it was from that then that I moved from my postdoc onto my first teaching position there in 2018, which was at Imperial as well as a teaching fellow. And it was a really nice experience because At that stage, Imperial was really investing in their scholarship. So they had just set up a new institute called CHERS, CHERS, which was the Center for Higher Education Research and Scholarship. And that was a really exciting investment by the university to try to promote scholarship. So as a young teaching fellow coming through that process was really exciting. A lot of my lecturers from the PGCHE were there leading that initiative. So I got a nice insight into actual scholarship and into education. And with my teaching fellow hat on, I was able to initiate some initiatives with students and actually use this. You can see at the top there, the Student Shapers program there. So that was an initiative delivered by CHERS, the scholarship network, that provided funding for teaching fellows to engage with students, active students, to co-design certain educational initiatives across the university. So I was working, I've got a few different funded opportunities to develop some practicals and assessments and talk with students around what they wanted out of those practices, particularly within the life sciences. And what was really lovely there was thinking about the real need for authentic assessment and authentic learning. So that's really what got me excited when I was talking with these students and thinking about ways to change their teaching practices to make their understanding of the work that they do more authentic and identify that they're not just there to answer questions, to stratify individuals, which is what Imperial's pretty good at, but actually coming up with these authentic opportunities that they would be able to practice and use their skills in an actual environment, which was similar to what they would be expected to in real life. So that was that was great to do. I really enjoyed that process. And then I was able to transfer from there to my current university in Queen's in Belfast, where I got my first, well, I say OE, which is open-ended teaching and scholarship contract. And I put that in there just because it allowed me to really change my mindset a little bit more, because I felt much more comfortable and I could see longitudinal aspects to my position. And I think that really helped me adopt a more wider stance and long-term stance in my thinking around my scholarship. And I was able to identify, okay, well, what initiatives can I put in place and track impact over a longer period of time? Because now I knew I was there for a longer time rather than just a fixed term fellowship. So that really did change my thinking. And I was able to get a master's then here in educational studies with the university, where I could start engaging in research properly, as well as go to advanced HE meetings, get involved in networks like this and other networks across the UK and beyond, to learn from other colleagues and get involved in research. So I think that was really important to just put in there, because I think there's a lot of these fixed term contracts, and I think particularly within TNS contracts, it can be difficult to get something that's open-ended. So I did feel that gave me comfort and really kind of changed my perception on that. So in my current position here then in Queen's, again, I've been able to focus on that authentic learning and authentic assessment. So that's really kind of where I started identifying my golden thread, maybe not without reflecting on it, but maybe now being able to identify what that was and where that burning connection was. So I've been able to initiate some symposiums. So you can see that in the bottom left, this poster symposium for our first year biodiversity students, where they teach architectural students around the SDGs, around biodiversity and the impact of climate change and potential impact of climate change on species, biodiversity, and implications on societies around, say, like the Amazon or in sub-Saharan Africa. While the architectural students teach our biodiversity students about urban planning and thinking about greener spaces in cities and planning cities around the SDGs and making it a healthier city for both animals and for humans. Biodiversity more generally. So that was a really lovely way for students to present to both a specific audience for themselves and a kind of educated audience, as well as a less familiarized audience as well, which was lovely. And also engaging with another initiative, engaging PhD students with undergrad as well. That's where they can talk about research and where the students have to write reports on PhD students' presentations. So that was really good. And then as I started, because I started here at about the end of 2019, just before the COVID aspect. So I had to really learn a lot about technology and putting stuff online during that time. And so I was able to kind of start playing with different types of technologies to enhance authentic assessment, which was very difficult, I think, at the time of COVID, right? When everything became online, it was very difficult to integrate really authentic styles of learning across across a distance. So I started using new technologies. I was exploring technologies such as GatherTown, if anyone's familiar with that, which is like a two-dimensional a two-dimensional kind of dynamic conferencing software where students can talk to each other and move around in a space and interact with different objects. So we use that in our teaching to try to make teaching a little bit more dynamic and to put them also in spaces where we could create like a scenario where students were engaging each other in, well, almost like a real life scenario. So we're thinking about that both in the scientific context, and I wrote a paper there with my friend in Sheffield thinking about how we can use that in the language learning context as well. And that and I think that opportunity to look at technology was really exciting, and thinking how we can use technology to enhance these authentic learning opportunities and situations. And so now I've been developing work with the computer sciences students here at Queen's, master's students, undergrad students, to develop new tools and technologies that can enhance our practical lessons and our seminar lessons and also the resources in the school that we have here in School of Biological Sciences to engage students in a new way in their learning. So I've got a little clip there on the bottom right of the BioLab Assist. This is an application that was developed by one of our master's students in computer science that uses augmented reality to enhance what's pretty honestly a really boring practical that I teach on amino acid titration, if anyone knows. So students can actually see chemical changes in molecules on the desk, so they can actually look at augmented reality and see the molecules change, what they wouldn't be able to do in real life. So it really engages students, enhances their motivation in that way, hopefully, and gets them to understand maybe something in a new way that they wouldn't have been able to address before. So I really love how technology can help us bridge and connect with that authentic assessment that students have. And I think naturally I've been able to progress in this way of just kind of following my interests, but now looking back has really been where my golden thread is developing, how we can enhance authentic assessment, but kind of utilizing and leveraging on technology in how to do that. So I hope I'll progress that through this network and through other colleagues that I have and continuing to do that. So it's just a little bit about me. Hopefully that was useful. I'm happy to talk more about that. So yeah, I'd like to pass on to Rose. Sorry, I forgot I was going to do that. That was usually. Yes, so I'd love to introduce Rose now to talk about her experiences.
Thanks, Colin. That was wonderful. And thank you to Julie and Hannah and Emma Jane for inviting me to come along and talk today. And thank you all for attending. I thought I would just talk you through a little bit of the sort of pictures and arrows on my slides, and perhaps just say a little bit about my sort of journey to becoming an associate professor on the teaching and scholarship pathway at Nottingham Trent University, which I did in 2024. So I'm going to try and sort of take us through sort of key points of my own journey that led me to kind of get to that position and feel that I could make a claim for associate professor on the teaching and scholarship pathway. I guess like lots of people, I started out very embedded in my own discipline. And if I go way back, and it is quite a long time ago back now for me, over 25 years ago, when I started out as a lecturer in politics at the University of Swansea initially, and then Central Lancashire, I was finishing my PhD, but I got more and more involved in teaching, and it was like I was being pulled in two directions, and the teaching was just absolutely fascinating for me. But the interesting thing, and if you start on the sort of top left of my slides, you'll see there's a not very clear picture of Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, and then there's a picture of Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. And I started out as a young lecturer in politics looking at political theory. My PhD was on political theory. And I continually came up against this question about, oh, you teach politics, so what do you think about the Prime Minister? What do you think about political parties? And I continually felt, both in academic circles and in circles more widely socially, I was being sort of othered in a way, because I was teaching an area of politics and the politics curriculum that doesn't often get sort of the same focus, if you like. It's not the sort of stereotype of what people study when they look at politics and the discipline of politics and the study of politics in higher education. So so that got me thinking, and I was so passionate, and still am so passionate, about teaching this subject area. And I thought, well, that's really strange, because people seem to think I do something else. And what is that about the curriculum? And what is that about how we portray disciplines and how we understand them? And what impact does that have? So I started to sort of think, maybe this is an area I want to look at more. So moving on a little bit further in time, I thought, well, politics and recruiting students to politics and to study politics at university is often a kind of quite complex thing. Students don't always study it. They don't know what the subject is. So, and in particular, when I was doing this, politics tended to be almost universally studied by men and taught by men. And in fact, political theory was always about white men, predominantly dead white men thinkers. And I started to realize that there was what I felt was a gap in all of this, particularly around the politics curriculum. So moving on in my slides, I ended up leading a big project with a large fund from the Fund for the Development of Teaching and Learning by what was then the Higher Education Academy and the Department of Education, to explore the question of how to develop tools and ways in which we could develop better understanding amongst young people on the study of politics at university. So I still wasn't kind of thinking about scholarship, but I was beginning to sort of move away from what you might call a more traditional research focus and beginning to look at teaching and learning issues. And that got me really interested even more in the politics curriculum and why we teach certain subjects in the way we teach them in certain areas. And what is the politics curriculum? So sort of moving further across on my slide with the arrows, sometime later, there was a big change centrally in government with our national curriculum and A-level reform. And I found myself working with my learned society, my professional body, looking at the A-level politics curriculum, initially as a consultant for one of the awarding bodies, and then more centrally with Ofqual, to think, how do we reshape the A-level politics curriculum? And that fascinated me. And I've got a little picture there of Mary Wollstonecraft, because this all led to a revised draft of the A-level politics curriculum. It was circulated for consultation. There was very little on women and feminism, which got a great big sort of reaction. So there's a big debate there about what should be in that curriculum that we had to address and deal with. And around that time, I was also very interested in how to bring greater sort of a range of skills and understanding and greater intercultural competencies into my teaching and into the politics curriculum. So I also got interested in internationalizing the curriculum, and that's what the orange sort of circle on my slide is all about. That's the Higher Education Academy, now Advanced HE's guide to internationalizing the curriculum. And I got involved with the Higher Education Academy's strategic enhancement projects and the internationalizing the curriculum strand, to try and develop and more broadly across the social sciences how we bring about internationalization within the curriculum. Hopefully I'm saying the curriculum enough to think that there's a common theme coming out in my talk now, because sort of much more recently, I was involved, I put in an expression of interest to be involved in the review and reform of our subject benchmark statements for politics and international relations. So again, my return to looking at the politics curriculum. Whilst I've been on that journey, I also found ways to sort of get recognition for what I was doing by working through the Higher Education Academy's recognition scheme. So I think for me, another important part of my developing awareness of scholarship and developing awareness of teaching and learning was through engaging in first fellow and then senior fellow and now principal fellow recognition through the Higher Education Academy, because that helped me reflect on what I've been doing and started to build in and embed more reflection on scholarship. So that broadly, and hopefully not in too short a summary, is my sort of journey through from initially starting out as a lecturer in politics, thinking, why do people not understand that I'm teaching this area of politics that perhaps isn't the stereotypical area, through all these projects about how do students come to university, why do they come and study certain subjects, how do we develop that curriculum nationally, what does it look like, what should be in the curriculum, how do we create a range of competencies when we teach our students, what about intercultural competencies and internationalization, and how do we build our own professional development as we go through that journey and reflect on what we've been doing. And I would say the kind of experience of engaging with the Higher Education Academy's sort of recognition scheme was very important for me, along with lots of great colleagues to talk to about this and a teaching and learning network within my own discipline, as well as more broadly national organisations. So my very final bit on the slide, my own national organisation, the Political Studies Association, was very important as an organisation for me to get involved in, particularly their teaching and learning activities. And scholarship, well, out of that journey, out of that golden thread, so I've come to focus more on scholarship in its own right, and to start thinking about it in terms of how we develop understandings of scholarship in particular, and reward and recognition for staff within the higher education context. But that's very much where I've moved into. I hope that gives you a little flavour of my journey through a teaching focused journey, and one that I'm hugely proud of and absolutely loved and would really want to advocate for, because it's been hugely rewarding for me to be able to do these things. So I think I need to hand to Emma Jane. So
thanks, Rose.
Thank you.
That was so interesting. Thank you so much. And Colin. Thanks for asking me to talk, Julie, today. And I guess where I come from with all of this is I've never really fitted in anything I've done at any point in my career. And this is career number 3, and I'm not sure it's the last one. If I'm honest, I think there's another one to go, but I don't know what it is yet. I guess the bit that's the golden thread through almost everything, I started out working in theatre and television. Then I moved into primary school teaching, became a head teacher, was a policy advisor for Welsh Government, and then 10 years ago ended up at Cardiff University. And I never planned to be an academic. I think I'm an accidental academic. I'm loving every second of it, but there's something about not fitting all the way through. And I think I've learned to like that, or even maybe love it. And that's really interesting for me, because it helps me to think about things differently. I guess the one thing that sticks through everything I've done is education and learning, and trying to understand what is happening in that moment. And it all started right back when I was working in Yorkshire. I was responsible for the theatre and education remit for Yorkshire. And I was in a school, and there was a 4-year-old, and we'd taken a workshop in to do with the story of Cinderella. And he said in the workshop to the fairy godmother, football, why'd you... No, the fairy godmother said to Cinderella, football, why do you want a football? And he said, no, a ball's where ladies dance with misters. And it was that single moment where this little 4-year-old, who on so many levels shouldn't really have known what a masked ball was, that kind of dance. I came home that night, said to my now husband, I think I want to be a teacher. Because in that moment, I wanted to understand what happened. And so I retrained, became a teacher, and here I am. And I think there's just something about learning and teaching that fascinates me and excites me. I find it, and my first little infographic on the slide, I love it, but it's equally terrifying in equal measure, because you're constantly problem solving, you're constantly working out, it never stays the same, you're having to adapt, you're having to change. And then that takes me to my second one, which is about this idea of, through kind of tackling that and working with that, you grow and you develop a resilience, and you think, well, I can do this. And if I can't do it, I'll go and find out how to do it. And that's a little bit how I felt when I joined Cardiff University. I felt completely like a fish out of water. I'd been a head teacher, I'd worked for Welsh Government, and I was in this world that I didn't really understand, that seemed really alien to me. I'd done a master's while I was working, part-time master's professionally. I didn't have a PhD. I'd thought about doing a PhD while I was a teacher, but here I was, I'd arrived at Cardiff University, and there were all these acronyms that I didn't really understand. And people did things in very strange ways, and we talked about lots of things for endless amounts of time, or so it seemed to me. And I needed to work out how I fitted. And teaching and learning was it. Teaching and learning was what I really cared for. I'd come in to run a national master's program for teachers, so I was still heavily involved with the profession. So I kept thinking about this, and I kept thinking, people used to say to me things like, well, they're different, these grown-ups. Teaching adults is totally different. And I kept wondering whether it really was, because for me, teaching is about relationships. It's about meeting your learners where they are. And that's my next little Venn diagram. So it was all for me about building relationships, thinking about how you learn, how you connect with your learners, how you make that happen when you've got 200 in a space, and equally when you're doing a one-to-one supervision for a master's or a PhD. So that's always been my thread. And I think the other thing I've been tremendously lucky all the way through my career is I've had brilliant mentors. And even though it's International Women's Day and lots of those mentors have been women, so much of where I've got to now is down to 3 men in my life: my dad, my husband, and my son, because they have tremendous belief in me. And I think that's something that's really important to kind of acknowledge, that I've had brilliant people around me that have really enabled my career. And then brilliant mentors along the way that have kind of reinforced that you can do something. And I guess the other thing is I've always surrounded myself with people who think differently. Different thinkers are really helpful because they help you see things from different perspectives. And all the way through, I've found people who are like-minded, who care passionately about learning and teaching, but that make me think differently about what I'm doing. And yeah, I discovered Advanced HE. Not very many people in my school had ever heard of it. So there weren't established mechanisms in our school, in our context, when I first engaged with that. So I went for senior fellow, and lots of people said to me, oh, well, you can't do that, you have to do fellow first. And I wondered why. So I said, well, let me have a go. And so I had a go and I got it. And then it's always been like that. And I became a prof in 2021, I think. And that was never the aim. But what it's really about for me is it has enabled me to advocate and to really work hard to enable opportunities for other people, to work with lots of brilliant colleagues, to really question and challenge the status quo. And that's kind of what I like doing a little bit. Which is very annoying for other people sometimes, but I'm kind of okay with that. And the last thing I'll leave you with is I have a quote that's on my desktop all the time. So I open it every day and I see it. And it's, here's to the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in square holes, and the ones who see things differently. And it goes on. But that kind of is what I'm about, is how we see things differently, how we work with the brilliant expertise and talents that teaching focused people bring to the profession, and how we use that to help our sector become even better than it already is. And so I'm going to hand back to Julie now. Thanks, Julie.
you there for a minute. Thank you, Emma Jane and Rose and Colin, for some fabulous narratives. I'm going to briefly share mine with you. So a similarly windy road. I sometimes think I should have the Beatles playing in the background while I talk about my story, because it really is a long and winding road. But I don't really like the Beatles, so there you go. I started out, I did a degree in biology and psychology, combined honours degree, and was captured by a very lovely researcher, Professor Carol Hackney, who took me on to do a PhD at the sort of interface between biology and psychology around auditory neuroscience. So I was very much looking at the biological side of neuroscience at the start of my career as a PhD student. And I was looking at how the inner ear, converts auditory signals, sends them to the brain, and leaves us with a perception of sound. So it was all about how the cochlea within our inner ear helps us to perceive sound. And it was a solid PhD, but by the end of it, I was completely bored rigid, because it was a lot of work in electron microscope rooms and in photographic dark rooms. So I spent all my time on my own in a dark room with no other people. And if other people came in, that usually meant that they wrecked what I was trying to do scientifically, and I had to start again. So I really found by the end of 7 years that I was feeling quite isolated. At the same time as I was doing my PhD, I was also a single mum, and I had a mortgage, and I was trying to make ends meet. And so what I did was took on lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of teaching to try and A, keep myself sane, and B, keep myself solvent. So originally teaching was just a means to an end. But, so I'm moving now from my brain and cochlea in the first graphic to the second graphic, which is a young me in a teaching focused role. I took on so much teaching, and I taught for both the biology department, the psychology department, the neuroscience department. I even taught trainee teachers at one point. I taught in a further education college. I taught people who wanted to be in the police force. I taught anything and everything that I could teach. And it gave me a real sense of how students learn and how teachers teach. It was a completely bonkers way to go about life. But it gave me a real understanding of how teaching worked in different disciplines, of how students sometimes struggled. So I had some fast track courses that were for students who had no GCSEs previously, and we were trying to get them GCSEs in a year as mature students in an evening class, and really noticing how students in all these different contexts shared some similar challenges around barriers to learning. And some of that was around previous educational experiences. Some of that was around a lack of confidence. Some of that was around imposter syndrome. Some of that was around a lack of study skills. And a little light came on in my head during all this and said, you've got a psychology degree. You can start to understand this. You can use psychology to understand why people experience challenges in learning, why some kinds of teaching seem to work and some kinds of teaching don't. You can start to take this apart. And so I did, and I shared with my students that lack of confidence as well. It was something that I had too, because I'd come from a non-traditional background myself. So I'd come to uni thinking, oh, I shouldn't be here. So I kind of really wanted to understand this, and I got fascinated by it. So having got my PhD and done all this teaching, I got myself a teaching focused role in a psychology department and spent several years teaching and supporting students. And part of my job was to support students who were either underachieving or at risk of dropping out, because the department I was working in had a really high dropout rate at the time. And so I set up a psychology-specific learning support service and worked with students to try and help them to overcome the problems that they were experiencing. And what I realized I was doing a lot of the time was I was making explicit the hidden curriculum. So all of those things that we think students should know how to do, they should know how to write in sentences, they should know how to write a lab report, they should know how to read a journal article, you know, they should know all of these things. And actually, no, they shouldn't, because they've never been taught before. And these are things that we, as the university sector, often just assumes that students can fall into and pick up, and they couldn't. And so I spent a lot of my time kind of surfacing these skills and working with students to help them to understand them, and started to produce handouts and workshops and things to help to train students in study skills and learning methods, learning skills. And one of those handouts got picked up by a mentor of mine who published it. And he came back to me one day and said, I've got an offer from a publisher to publish your handout. Is that okay? I was like, what? And I've never published anything independently in my life, because my PhD supervisors had very much taken on publications from my PhD rather than me doing it. And I was still labouring under this apprehension that I wasn't a real academic, because I was just a teaching focused academic and I wasn't publishing papers. And so I wasn't a real academic. And he really boosted me by saying, you know, somebody actually wants to pay you to publish this handout that you've written for your students. And it made me really sort of stop and think, actually, maybe there's something in all this. And I did my teacher training course, and I got my fellow with the HEA recognition. And then I got a lectureship that was actually a teaching and research lectureship. And I made my research topic about student assessment and feedback. Why do students sometimes not read their feedback? Why don't they always value their feedback? Why do we spend ages writing it and then it doesn't make any sense to anybody? And that was the beginning of my scholarship career. And what I realised, and I'm moving now on to my third graphic here, which is Kern's activities relating to teaching. What I realised was that I could use my psychological skills and knowledge, not just for me to understand my students, but for me to investigate learning and teaching and to find ways to improve and enhance learning and teaching. So I started to do a little bit of academic development work, started to do a little bit of SOTL, and started to share what I was doing with others. And then I worked for the HEA for a while, so I was the discipline lead for psychology. And then I moved to a senior teaching fellowship, and then a leadership, and then finally professorship now at Nottingham-Trent University. And what I've done in that intervening time is really to formalise and systematise what I do, and to learn to make it more public, to disseminate it more, and really to take my scholarship out to the rest of the world and hopefully help other people to improve their own learning and teaching. So instead of having impact on my own students anymore, I'm now having an impact on other academics who can then impact on their own students. So it's a kind of a cascade effect, and I can hit more people. So yes, I'm still slightly reeling from the fact that I managed to get my professorship. But what I'm finding now is that I'm also studying scholarship, and I'm supporting others to develop their scholarship and their teaching focused careers. And the Profs in Prep Network is a part of that. So that's my story. And what I'm going to do is suggest, I'm going to take us to a break because it's 5 to 11. I'm going to suggest that we take a stretch. We look away from our computer screens, and we just take, is 5 minutes enough, do we think? Yeah, take a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we will go into some breakout rooms. We'll come back to the main room first, and then we'll go out into breakout rooms and talk about some of the things that we can reflect on from those stories. Okay, so it's 5 to 11 and I will see you back here at 11 o'clock. I suggest you just pop your camera off and go for a walk around your room. Okay, so you've heard 4 different scholarship stories. You heard from Colin with his biosciences background. You heard from Rose with her political studies background. You heard from Emma in her education background, and me with my psychology background. And despite our different disciplines, I think there's some things that all 4 of us share in common. And there are some ways in which we're quite distinctive and quite different from each other. But hopefully what you've managed to pull out of our stories is some sense of a golden thread, some sense of a uniting, coherent structure or message that runs through our different stories. So what I'd like you to do is to go into breakout rooms, and you don't have to do anything for this. They will just happen to you. I believe Hannah or Emma Jane, one of them, Hannah, is going to miraculously whisk you into a whole new virtual space, and to think about this idea of what will you profess in. So think about our stories, and then think about what will you profess in, what's your expertise, and what does your narrative focus on. I'm just going to give you 15 minutes to have a chat in your groups about those questions, and I'll pop them in the chat for you as well. So off you go to your rooms. You might have a stop and join invite on your screen.